Okay, let me get this straight. You're gonna go fight a dragon and rescue a princess just so Farquaad to give you back a swamp, which you only don't have because he filled it full of freaks in the first place. Is that about right?
You know what? Maybe there's a good reason donkeys shouldn't talk.
I don't get it, Shrek. Why don't you just pull some of that ogre stuff on him? You know, throttle him, lay siege to his fortress, grind his bones to make your bread. You know the whole ogre trip.
Oh, I know what. Maybe I could have decapitated an entire village and put their heads on a pike, got a knife, cut open their spleen, and drink their fluids. Does that sound good to you?
No, not really, no.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody likes onions. Cake! Everybody loves cakes.
I've used that clip at least a couple of times already. I'm going to use it again and again and again because it makes such a really important point. So you might as well give in. If you haven't seen Shrek, you should. Watch the movie, go to the stage musical. They're both awesome. You need to see it. Shout out to Damien and Bashaw, by the way, who famously was Shrek in the Bashaw Community Theater production. One of my favorite musicals still. It makes a really important point. Listen, it's like this. Jesus told a lot of parables. Anywhere from 12 to 50, depending on who you ask. That number varies so dramatically because people have different ideas of exactly what a parable is. Basically, all a parable is a short story that illustrates a moral or ethical point. That's the point of a parable. But there's all sorts of other issues there. There's context, there's perceptions, there's how long is it? What's the difference between a parable and a metaphor or an allegory? There's all sorts of people who have different criteria for parables. That's why we can pretty much agree there's at least 12, but there might be as many as 50 in the Gospels. They're all different. They're all different, you see, because parables, very much like Jesus, parables are like ogres. They have layers. Don't we all? That's also another thing about parables, is how we come to them, because we all have layers too. Where we come from in our own context can sometimes change how we view a parable. Isn't it great then that there's at least some parables that Jesus explained himself so we'd know for sure? Here's the thing. Between 12 and 50 parables in the Gospels, and Jesus explained 2 of them. Just 2. And they are both in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. They both involve planting of some kind. 2. Which is why there are many biblical scholars, people way smarter than me that study this stuff all the time, who think that in fact Jesus didn't explain these 2 parables. The author of the Gospel of Matthew decided to write in an explanation, and so the author of the Gospel of Matthew had Jesus explain these 2 parables. Mostly because that way you would know exactly what the parables meant so that they could be in keeping with the various themes and ideas that the Gospel of Matthew is trying to share with you. Yes, the Gospels have their own themes and ideas. That's why we have 4 of them. And there's many more, by the way, but there's 4 in the Bible. They're all telling relatively the same story, but they don't tell it exactly the same way, do they? And that's because they're each promoting a particular idea or theme. And so the thinking is that the author of the Gospel of Matthew explained these two parables so that you would know that they fit right in with his themes and ideas, or her themes and ideas. Thing is, for a very long time, we haven't questioned what Jesus may or may not have said in the Bible. And so for a very long time, we have traditionally understood these two parables, the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds, or if you're feeling old-timey King James-ish, it's, I believe, the parable of the wheat and tares. We even named them according to how Jesus explained them. And that's how we've traditionally understood them. So let's look at this parable of the weeds, the wheat and the tares, for just a second, because the way Jesus explains it is, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? The farmer's Jesus, we're the world, right? And there are wheat and there are weeds. The weeds, of course, are provided by the evil one, the devil. In the great Eden of farmland that God has created, the devil plants evil. And so these two things start to grow, and the farmer sees that, and the farmer's helpers, householder slaves, hate that, but they see this too, and they say, hey, should we pull these out? And the farmer goes, no, let them grow together, because if you start pulling out the weeds, you'll pull out the wheat too. It'll be damaged as well. So let it grow until we harvest them, and then when we harvest them, the wheat will go in the barn, and the weeds are going to go to the fiery pit. So the point, obviously, is don't be a weed. You want to be wheat, don't you? Because otherwise you're going to end up in the fiery place. That's a perfectly reasonable explanation, too, particularly if you're the author of the Gospel of Matthew. But there's nothing wrong with seeing it that way, because after all, parables are like ogres. They have layers. And also, as you were watching that clip, I hope you heard all the stuff that came before that too, because that's how we traditionally understand what an ogre is. Traditionally understand what an ogre is. And Shrek's point, of course, is ogres aren't necessarily like that. So if there's an ogre living on your block, you should probably get to know them before you decide how they really are. Then you won't be quite so worried about your spleen. Anyway, the point is that it's not just a question then of understanding because we were told it means this. It's a question of actually having to think for yourself, which I think is actually the point of parables. That's the point. The point isn't, it means this. The point is, what do you think? So I think that's why Jesus teaches in parables, which is also, by the way, one of the reasons why, amongst others, including the fact that he only explains two, why biblical scholars think that this wasn't Jesus explaining these two parables at all. Because Jesus teaches with parables. You don't teach with a story that you then have to explain. You teach with a story that illustrates what you have already explained. And that's the point of parables. So if Jesus has to actually explain what the parables mean, what would be the point of telling the parable? It would be very much like, say, if you had a preacher who very consistently used pop culture references that you didn't know, and he had to explain, oh, I see. Yeah. Except, the thing is, in Jesus' day, things were a lot simpler, weren't they? And the pop culture references that Jesus uses, he could be pretty certain you knew what he was talking about. Biblical references, things about farming when he's talking to farmers. Jesus knew his audience. That's why he used parables. He told stories that he knew you could connect with. So you'd get the point. And the point is, think for yourself about this. Don't just listen to me tell you what it means. Think about it. Think about it. So let's look at this parable of the weeds then, for instance. If you go with the traditional explanation, explanation of what this parable is about, which is based on this is what Jesus said. It's a parable of judgment. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is how the world works. There are wheat and there are weeds. You want to be wheat because there will be a day of harvest, a day of judgment, and the wheat will go to the good place, and the weeds are going to go to the fiery pit for eternity. I have some questions, though. If you're going to go with that understanding of the parable, you got to remember a few things. First of all, the parable actually begins with, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. So what exactly are we talking about when we say the kingdom of heaven? Does Jesus mean the kingdom of heaven that you're going to go to if you're wheat? Does Jesus mean the kingdom of heaven he keeps consistently talking about is either near or here right now? Which is it? Is this a parable of journey to the kingdom of heaven? Or is it about this is the kingdom of heaven? Because if this is the kingdom of heaven, whichever of those heavens it is, it's a heaven in which there are weeds and wheat at the same time. And there are definitely wheat and weeds in the world in which we live, isn't there? Hang on. Here's a layer. What's wheat? What's weeds? What is a weed anyway? Really? Going to come back to that. But you also have to bear in mind that there's an evil one in this story. So much like we have traditionally done, not only God is an entity, but the evil one is an entity. The devil is a thing. It is an entity. Not just a force, but a thing that intentionally does stuff, like plant evil in the world. Are you okay with that? Because if you are, then you move on to the next step, which is at the day of harvest, which is coming, there is judgment. Hang on, though. You're going to have to remember, of course, that that judgment isn't up to you. It's God that judges. Are you okay with that? You're going to say yes, but the thing is, we judge all the time. We do. Particularly if the kingdom of heaven that we're talking about in this story is the world in which we live, we judge all the time. What if? What if we looked at a few of those things a little bit differently? What if right from the start we did actually think that the kingdom of heaven that Jesus is talking about is the kingdom of heaven that is near or here? That we can make the kingdom of heaven be here? And the first thing is that we're going to have to recognize that there are wheat and weeds. There are the things that we perceive to belong, and then there are the weeds. Because that's what a weed is, after all, isn't it? It's something that doesn't belong. I mean, we tend to think of weeds are bad, hence the evil one plants them. But realistically, if you have intentionally planted a field of wheat, whatever else grows in there is a weed, because you're wanting to grow wheat. If you have a garden full of flowers, and you want flowers to grow there, whatever else grows there that isn't the flower that you planted or wished to have there, it's a weed. If you have a perfectly green lawn, and there's a dandelion smack in the middle of it, it's a weed. Even if a 4-year-old goes and picks it and brings it to you because it's a pretty flower, in your head you're still thinking it's a weed. You're not going to say that, of course, are you? But it's still a weed in your head because it doesn't belong there. By the way, this whole time behind me, I don't know if you've noticed, but you've been looking at weed. In fact, you've been looking at weed. That is what is commonly referred to as feral cannabis. That is weed that spontaneously grows in the wild. Spontaneously is a bit of that's not entirely true, because they think the reason that happens is because somewhere nearby someone has been growing it on purpose, and the seed just spread around. But that's believe it or not, by a highway in Nebraska. What is a weed? Now, if you're going to say dandelions are weeds, sure, in a particular context, but there's another context in which they're not, which is that $42 salad in a fancy restaurant that you just paid for. Much of what's in that salad was probably we used to call them weeds. Who's had dandelion wine? There are uses for it. And that's the thing about weeds, is you might say, in this particular context, that's a weed, but the fact is there might be a use for it. So what is a weed to you? In the story, it simply is something that doesn't belong. What if this isn't a parable about judgment at all? What if it's a parable about belonging? Do you think the wheat is aware of what's a weed? Or are the weeds aware of what's wheat? And who is it that says, no, let them coexist? Let them grow together. What if the farmer is actually the creator? What if the farmer is God? And the farm is all of this. And the point of Jesus telling this story is that we all grow together because we all belong. Whether we, being the workers in the fields, judge these things to be wheat or weeds, we shouldn't. They should all belong and all grow together. Is there going to be a time when we're going to have to decide? Sure. But what if instead of thinking of it as a judgment thing, because we're the ones who are going to judge which is which, what if this is a story about how everyone belongs in this world, and there is a time when we determine our purpose, and that is what we do? Because you know what? We do harvests all the time. In this story, you want to think that harvest is the day of judgment. It's, your end. But through our lives, there are moments of such dramatic change in our lives. Whether that's, graduating from kindergarten, or graduating from high school, graduating from university or college, whether it's getting married or having children, there are moments that dramatically change our lives and either reinforce or question what we're all about, what our purpose is. So what if that's what the story's about? It's about in this world, we all grow together. We all belong. Regardless of whether you think somebody's a weed or you think somebody's wheat. What if it's about how we're all supposed to belong? There are so many layers to this story. And I think Jesus tells these stories in part because he just wants you to think about what he's been talking about, what he's been showing you. And I think one of the things here is Jesus has been showing us that there are no weeds and grain and different things when it comes to belonging. We can all belong together. Does that mean we're all the same? No. That's why some might be grain, or different kinds of grain. Some might be different kinds of what we would think of as weeds, but what makes it a weed? You have to think about this stuff. You have to think about this stuff. That's the point. It's very easy to look at a parable and listen to someone tell you, it means this. Great, I don't have to think about it now. I know what it means. But Jesus' point is always, think about it. What does it mean to your life? What is it saying to your life? Think of the different contexts in which we could apply this parable today if we saw it as a parable of belonging. If we saw it as a parable where we're not the ones who determine what's grain and what's weed. Think about the places where we can apply that right here. We're always talking about how we want people to feel like they belong in church. What about in our community? We're always talking about how we want people to feel like they belong. So what's belonging? Is belonging mean I tell you how this is going to go and you decide whether you're going to fit in? No, it is not. Belonging means you bring you and we grow together. If you just feel like you fit in because this is kind of the way you think and that's all, that's not belonging. It's fitting in. If you want to belong, you have to be part. You have to bring you to it as well. You have to participate. We have to grow together. And we all have to then be accepting of the fact that we grow together. That's what makes the field. Sometimes I drive back and forth between Vashon-Ponoka a lot, obviously. Sometimes I really like driving by, there's those big open fields. And then sometimes every now and then you'll see those like a little clump of trees or bushes in the middle of it where they had to go around it. I love that. Because the field's not perfect, is it? There's something else. I can see something else there. But then I think about all the things I can't see that might be growing in there. That's what our communities are like. That's what the world is like. We all grow together. That's what makes the best field.